Stephanie Davis, and my presentation today is going to be on non-dilutive funding opportunities for heart, lung, blood, and sleep-related biomedical technologies. So I wanted to start by telling you all about the small business grant programs, which I manage at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So there are two main small business grant programs that the NIH participates in. So the first is the parent program, also known as the Small Business Innovation Research or SBIR program. So this program is designed to provide set-aside funds for small businesses that are conducting R&D or developing technologies that are of interest to the federal institute's mission. So this program is required for all federal agencies that have a research and development budget greater than $100 million. So just for this past fiscal year, that means that each of the federal agencies that participates in the Small Business Innovation Research Program need to put aside 3.2% of their budget towards these types of grants. And the other sister program is the Small Business Technology Transfer Research or STTR program. This program is essentially identical to the SBIR program. The only main difference is that it requires some sort of collaboration between a small business concern and a US-based nonprofit research institution, usually a university or college. And the goal is for this collaboration to yield some sort of technology to be commercialized. So this program is required for all federal agencies that have an extramural R&D budget greater than $1 billion. So this past fiscal year, 0.45% of our extramural R&D budget went to STTR grants. So here is a pie chart just showing the allocations of NIH research dollars towards the small business programs. As you can see, NHLBI is—
Stephanie, sorry again. I don't think your slides are advancing on the actual screen share.
Give me a second.
You might have to stop sharing and then reshare again.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's showing the pie chart right now.
Okay, that's correct. Okay, so this pie chart shows the size of the small business grant budgets at each of the federal, at each of the institutes at the NIH. So just overall, our total budget for both programs is about $1.23 billion. And at the NHLBI, this past year, the budget for our small business grant program was $120 million. So as you all can see by the yellow slice, we are one of the largest small business grant programs at the NIH. So one question that you all might be having is what are the eligibility requirements for the SBIR and STTR programs? So in a sense, you have to be an organized for-profit small business concern that is owned and operated within the US. You do have to have 500 or fewer employees, although most of the businesses that we fund through the Small Business Grant Program are much smaller than that, usually 50 or fewer employees. All of the work must be done within the US. There are some exceptions that sometimes NIH agencies will grant, but usually this requires some sort of very strong scientific justification. So for all intents and purposes, the work needs to be done stateside. Also, the business must be at least 50% US owned and operated by individuals. It also might be at least 50% owned and controlled by another small business concern that is 50% owned or controlled by one or more individuals. And if it is an SBIR recipient, it can be at least 50% or more owned and operated by multiple venture capital operating companies, so long as it's not one company owning the majority of the business. So one thing that is important to remember is that in all cases, both with the SBIR and the STTR programs, the award is always made to the small business, even if there is a collaboration with an academic institution.
Hey, Stephanie, sorry, again, the slides just aren't advancing. What we see.
Hey, Emily, can you do me a favor? Can you share the slides for me and I can just tell you when to advance them?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Let me pull them up.
Okay, can you please go to slide 5? Oh, next slide. Thank you. All right. So, oh, no, previous slide. This is the one. Okay, so what are the advantages to seeking SBIR or STTR funding? So one of the greatest advantages to seeking an SBIR or STTR grant is because the NIH specifically, we usually invest in technologies that are very early stage that haven't been sufficiently de-risked for private investors. So, we're usually willing to invest in things that are pretty risky. And our goal, of course, is to invest enough federal dollars in these technologies that they are sufficiently de-risked and then ready for external investors. This is a non-dilutive source of funding capital, which means it's not there's no loan payment required. It's not going to affect the prices of your shares or your stocks. This does allow the small business to maintain IP rights. It can provide credibility and visibility to your small business. And as I mentioned earlier, this also provides leverage to attract other sources of funding, specifically strategic partners and or venture capital firms. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, there are a lot of similarities between the SBIR and STTR programs. Some of the key differences is that with an SBIR grantee, there is allowed to be a partnership between the small business concern and some sort of other party. With an STTR award, there is a required partnership between the small business concern and a nonprofit research institution. In the case of SBIR grants, there is a requirement that at the time of the award, the PI's primary employment must be with the small business. With an STTR award, the PI may either be primarily employed with the research institute or with the small business. The main requirement is that they have to dedicate at least 10% effort to the project. And with the SBIR, in terms of the work and the budget outsourcing requirements, generally speaking, the maximum percentage of the budget that can be outsourced for a phase 1 SBIR grant is going to be 33%, and it moves up to 50% for phase 2. These are a bit flexible, and there are sometimes cases where the outsourcing requirements may be waived. For the STTR program, these minimum work requirements are not flexible since they are written into the congressional mandate. They are set in stone, but the requirements for an STTR award are that the small business must do at least 40% of the work, and the research institution partner must do at least 30%. The remaining 30% can be given to either party or split between the two. Next slide, please. So in the small business grant program, and this does differ between federal agencies, there are I call it 2.5 phases that the NHLBI and the NIH in general will fund. So the phase 1 small business grant program is mostly focused on giving small businesses money to conduct feasibility and proof of concept studies. The second phase of the program is focused more on full research and development and scaling up commercialization efforts. So phase 1 and phase 2 grants are the 2 standard types of small business awards. We do also have 2 other options that kind of fall outside those 2 categories. one of which is known as the Fast Track Award. I call it a 2-for-1 special because when you apply for the Fast Track program, you are essentially applying for both the phase 1 and the phase 2 portions of the grant at the same time. So if you get funded for a Fast Track Award, once you complete your phase 1 milestones, you can move on to the phase 2 without having to reapply. There's also an option known as the Direct to Phase 2 program. So for businesses that have done a lot of feasibility studies and they're significantly more advanced than other applicants, they can sometimes provide evidence to the reviewers that they don't need to do the phase 1. They have already generated enough preliminary data, so they can apply directly to a phase 2 award without having to go through the phase 1 portion first. And at the NIH, we have programs known as the phase 2B programs. Some of the NIH institutes participate through kind of the main funding opportunity announcements. At the NHLBI, we have our own phase 2B programs that we only participate in ourselves, known as the Bridge and the Small Market programs. And basically, these programs are designed to provide companies that are developing some sort of technology that needs FDA approval with $3 million of additional funding over 3 years. And one of the reasons why we have our own program is because our phase 2B funding opportunities strongly encourage matching funds. And this is a really great way to provide leverage for external investors and bring them on as supporters by giving these businesses additional funds to further de-risk their technologies. We also participate in the Commercialization Readiness Pilot Program. This is kind of an add-on award that can either follow or occur at the same time as a phase 2 or phase 2B award. It's usually designed to cover activities that wouldn't normally be supported under the parent grant. We actually provide less than that. It's more of a $500,000 up to 2 years. This is something that the amount given out varies by institute. And then finally, the NIH does not participate in the phase 3 program. At other federal agencies, such as a lot of the DoD programs, phase 3 is where the agency acts as the buyer of the technology. At the NIH, what we do is we don't purchase technologies that we fund. We just want them to get to the point where the companies are independent of us. So when a company is in the phase 3, it means that they have progressed past the need for NIH small business funds. Next slide. So this diagram shows the steps that are required from the time that you submit your grant application until the notice of award actually goes out. So in summary, it usually varies from, I'd say, 5 to 8 months between the time that you submit your award and the time that it's actually funded. But when you submit your award through grants.gov or assist, it's going to be assigned to a study section or a scientific review group, as well as an institute. So for instance, if your technology focuses on heart disease, it's most likely going to be assigned to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So when it's assigned to this study section, the study section consists of reviewers with both business and scientific expertise. They're going to review your application based on its scientific and entrepreneurial merit. So when the review happens and all of the reviews are compiled, the scientific review officer will assign your proposal a priority score. So the lower the priority score you get, the more likely it is that your proposal is going to get funded. So the lowest that it goes is a 10. That's basically a perfect score. And for the most part at the NHLBI, we fund applications with priority scores between 10 and 40. So if it gets a score, it's going to go on to secondary review by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute Advisory Council. So council makes kind of large general recommendations, and after council meets, the program officers will meet with the NHLBI director to basically make recommendations on which grant should go forward for funding. And then once that happens, there's going to be what's known as the just-in-time process, where grants management staff will just collect any other necessary documents that are required before the project starts. And then finally, the notice of award goes out, and that's when the project officially starts. So basically, it's kind of a long process. We tried to make it less slow, but it is the government. So the moral of the story is to don't wait and always apply well ahead of time. So we have a question in the chat. I'm going to answer this from Stuart. What is the right way to apply for TABA funds in phase 1 or phase 2? So I will get to that, Stuart, but basically there are 2 different ways that applicants can take advantage of TABA funds, and I'll get to that shortly. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is a delay from the time that you apply for a small business grant and when the earliest project start date is. So for almost all of our small business funding opportunities, these are going to be the due dates: January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th. So if that due date falls on a federal holiday or a weekend, it's going to be moved to the next business day. So for instance, instead of September 5th, this year, the due date was September 7th because of Labor Day. So if you submit an application for the January funding cycle, so January 5th, most likely your application is going to get reviewed sometime in March or early April at the latest. And it is going to be up for consideration at our May 2022 Advisory Council. And then the earliest you can start your project is going to be July. It does differ based on funding cycles. So for instance, the September funding cycle has the longest delay because that's when it coincides with the congressional budgetary process. But once again, just keep in mind that when you submit a grant, you are going to have to wait for the project to start. Next slide, please. So at the NHLBI, we fund several different types of technologies, but all of them focus specifically on preventing, treating, and diagnosing heart, lung, blood, and sleep-related diseases. I should note there is a caveat. We only focus on non-oncological lung and blood diseases. So if you are developing something for leukemia, for instance, you will want to go to our colleagues at the National Cancer Institute. So for fiscal year 2021, our budget was approximately $120 million, and we currently fund approximately 312 active projects. So as you can see in this pie chart, this shows the breakdown of the types of technologies we fund. Please keep in mind that the types of technologies we fund can vary based on the types of applications that we get every year. So about 35% of our portfolio consists of therapeutics. So these include biologics, peptide therapeutics, small molecule drugs. The next largest part of our portfolio consists of supportive or therapeutic devices. So these are devices that are used to treat conditions as well as surgical devices. The next largest part of our portfolio consists of research tools and in vitro diagnostics and monitoring or sensing devices. And then the remainder of our portfolio consists of health IT or digital health type applications and imaging devices. So compared to a lot of institutes, we are very device heavy, but we still have a significant portion of our projects in the therapeutic space. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of some of the diseases that we fund at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So just if you're not sure about whether or not your proposal falls within our mission space, I welcome you to reach out to me. There is a lot of overlap between us and some other institutes based on the disease function. For instance, a great example is cardiovascular complications of diabetes mellitus, for instance. That is a huge area of overlap between us and the National Institute for Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases. So if you're unsure about whether or not your proposal is a good scientific fit for us, I highly recommend reaching out to me and I can talk to you about it. Next slide, please. So most of the small business grants that we fund at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute come in through what are known as the Omnibus funding opportunity announcements. So Omnibus is essentially a fancy way of saying that it covers everything. And at the NIH, most of our grants that we give out are what's known as investigator-initiated proposals. So we're not we're not focusing on funding a specific technology type or even for a specific disease area. These funding opportunities, all institutes that participate in the small business program participate in these 4 funding opportunity announcements, with a few exceptions. So at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, we will fund both non-clinical trial applications and clinical trial applications for both the phase 1 and the phase 2 portion, as well as for the SBIR and STTR programs. Sometimes some institutes will not fund clinical trials in certain phases or through the small business program. So once again, it is good to reach out to your program officer just to check and make sure that the institutes participate in the program. And so my colleague, Anne-Marie Brazil-Majak, who is a grants management specialist, put something about the TABA funds, which I will get to in a minute when we talk about budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're talking about budget. So there are, across the federal agencies, the general guidelines for phase 1 budgets are $150,000 per project, and for phase 2, it is about $1 million per project. Well, at the NIH, we understand that medical research is very expensive, so we actually worked with the Small Business Administration to negotiate our own hard caps. So unless otherwise stated, the hard caps for phase 1 proposals at the NIH are generally $259,000 for a phase 1 project and about $1.73 million over a 2-year period for phase 2 projects. Now, at the NHLBI, we will fund projects that are more expensive than these 2 hard caps. The key is that you do have to specify one of the Small Business Administration approved waiver topics when you submit your budget justification. So these topics are extremely broad and they cover almost everything that we fund. But the key is just making sure that you put one of these in there so you can request more than these hard caps. There was a, so you don't need to talk to a program officer beforehand in order to request something above the hard cap. If you want to request above the hard cap, you just need to put the topic in your budget justification. Now, right now, the NHLBI has some suggested caps of $300,000 for a phase 1 proposal and $2 million for a phase 2 proposal. This is not required, but I would highly recommend, if you are going to be requesting more than either one of those amounts for your project, to reach out to a program officer. You can reach out to me. I will connect you with one of my scientific colleagues whose portfolio kind of lies within your technologies area. So if you're concerned about that, I would recommend reaching out and giving us a heads up, because we have been known to fund more expensive projects, but usually we need some time to know ahead of time so we can work out our budget. Now, a few of you have asked questions about TABA funds. So TABA funds are, TABA is short for Technical and Business Assistance. So we at the NIH will give phase 1 applicants $6,500 and phase 2 applicants $50,000. For activities that are not necessarily related to the specific aims of the project. So some of the examples are, let's say you wanted to purchase a vendor who would provide market research for you. If it's anything related to commercialization activities and not R&D, it can fall under the TABA funds category. So basically what you need to do is you can request that $6,500 or that $50,000, and that doesn't count towards the budget cap. You just have to make sure that you request it under other direct costs and you put technical and business assistance in your detailed budget. So you do have to request TABA funds at the time of your application. If you do not, there are some NIH-wide technical and business assistance programs that you can participate in, but at this time, if you want money for technical and business assistance, it does have to be requested at the time of your application. So another thing to keep in mind is that the SBIR budgets are the SBIR grants are a bit different than other NIH grants. So those of you who have been PIs on R01s or other research project grants have probably seen that those are defined by direct costs. SBIR and STTR grants are a little bit different in that the budgets are defined by total costs, and there are the subcontracting requirements. So just be sure to read over the funding opportunity announcements and be aware of the subcontracting guidelines for both mechanisms. When you are putting your budget together, you can request a fee, which is basically the profit that is 7% of your total costs. And then another question that comes up a lot is that for early stage companies that are essentially virtual, a lot of them rely on CRO type activities to get your research and development activities done. So the question is do we allow CRO type activities to count as small business costs? The answer is yes, provided that these 3 rules are fulfilled. So A, the service must be commercially available. 2, the data analysis needs to be done by the small business. And 3 is that it must be done on a fee per basis. So you are paying just for the service to be done. You're not incurring any indirect costs by the fee for service providers. So this is a really great way to minimize the amount of subcontracting that is done with the small business budget. So if you have any questions about whether or not something would count as a fee for service activity, reach out to me and we can discuss it. Next slide, please. So the NHLBI Small Business Program is housed within the NHLBI Innovation Office. So while our office does provide a lot of opportunities for small businesses, we also provide support and knowledge for both academic innovators and other translational researchers. So this is just kind of an overview of programs that we provide to innovators from both of these communities. Next slide, please. So here are some of the programs that we participate in that are designed to cater towards academic innovators. So some of these include the Catalyze Program, which I will talk about a little bit later in my presentation because it is open to small businesses as well as academics. The CapCat program, which provides a lot of late stage entrepreneurial and regulatory support, and the NCAI and REACH program, which these are academic proof of concept centers that specifically help academics translate their discoveries from the bench and bring them towards commercialization. Next slide, please. So these are some of the programs that we offer towards small businesses particularly. So some of the programs that we have for grantees include the I-Core NIH program, which is an intense 8-week program focused on customer discovery. C3I, which is an entrepreneurial training program for medical device innovators. And then we also participate in the TAB and Needs Assessment program. So that is an NIH centralized program that's available to any company that receives a small business grant that did not request TAB of funds in the first part when they were applying for their award. So if they did not request that $6,500 or $50,000, they can get a comprehensive needs assessment report done that shows the areas of their company that are that are basically good to go and areas where de-risking and maturity is required. So in terms of awards that we give out, there are the main SBIR and STTR awards, the CRP awards, and the Phase 2B awards, both the Bridge and the Small Market Program. We also offer programs that specifically aim at increasing diversity and inclusion within the Small Business Grant Program. The Diversity Supplement Program, which was just renewed by the NIH, gives small businesses additional funds to provide salary support for candidates who are usually early career scientists, so graduate students, recent graduates, postdoctoral scholars who are from underrepresented minority groups. And specifically for the Small Business Grant Program, Diversity Supplements, we also support female candidates as well, since women are historically underrepresented in higher levels of leadership within the life sciences. We also offer a program called the Applicant Assistance Program, which I will go into in a few slides. Next slide, please. And one of the other things that our office does that is unique to the NHLBI is we have a team of entrepreneurs in residence and entrepreneurial experts that are there to provide kind of advice and consultations to both academic innovators and small business grantees. We also have what's known as the NHLBI Mentor Network, which these are business experts that are not employed by the NHLBI, but we engage them and bring them in to consult with our companies and our researchers and kind of provide targeting mentoring programs based on what that company needs. And then finally, we also work very closely with the NIH Seed Office, and that is the main small business and entrepreneurial office at the NIH. So to answer your question, Stuart, so the TABA Needs Assessment Program, that is technically considered TABA. That's the program that's available for people who did not request TABA funds in their application, but everything else is not considered TABA, only the Needs Assessment Program. So the investor showcases as well, we work together with the Seed Office to get companies ready for investor showcases. So our entrepreneurs and residents participate in coaching companies for these events. And we also, we will send companies to other events that are unique to us. So while we do work together with the Seed Office to send companies to the Bioannual Meeting, Resi, MedTech Conference, we also have unique showcases that are specific to our mission space, such as the annual Innovation Showcase at the American Heart Association Scientific Sessions. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of some of the lovely people that I get to work with in my role. So we have Dr. Renee Arnold. She is our current reimbursement and health economics and outcome research specialist. Dr. Gautam Prakash, he is our IP advisor, and he has been a long-time detailee from the US Patent and Trademark Office. We have Dr. Steve Flame, who is a cardiovascular physiologist by training, as well as an angel investor. He is our investor in residence, both to the NHLBI and to the NIH as a whole. And finally, we have Kwame Ulmer. He is our fourth EIR, and he is our regulatory specialist. And fun story, even though they work for our office, both Dr. Flame and Kwame are located in Southern California. Steve is in San Diego and Kwame is in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Applicant Assistance Program as one of the programs that we participate in that is specifically focused on improving diversity and inclusion of the small business program. So this is a unique program because it is actually offered to companies that have never received a small business grant before. And the goal of the AAP is to provide companies with a unique 10-week-long coaching experience that will show them how to put together a well-written and strong phase 1 small business grant proposal. So what will be provided to participants of the AAP include the review of your specific aims page, coaching through the submission process, and just general support for helping prepare your application. So the NHLBI has participated in this program for several years, but there are now 9 other institutes that participate in the AAP in addition to us. So the goal of the AAP is to provide companies that have a very encouraging technology but limited NIH grant writing experience. And we have used this program to actually encourage submissions from businesses owned and led by women and or historically underrepresented individuals. So if you fall in one of those 2 groups, we would highly encourage you to apply for the Applicant Assistance Program. The next due date is actually a little less than a week from today. So if you've never received funding from the NIH before and you want someone to help coach you through the process, I would highly recommend this program. Next slide, please. So finally, the Catalyze Program. So I mentioned this earlier. And Catalyze has a lot of aspects in common with the small business program, but it is a little bit different in some other ways. So this started off as kind of a pilot program that we started in 2019. And this would be kind of a huge supportive suite of services to give to academic innovators and small business innovators who are trying to commercialize technologies that are related to heart, lung, blood, and sleep disorders. So one of the advantages to the Catalyze program is that basically it comes with a lot of services in-house. So the funding that, when companies are selected for the Catalyze program through a grant, they not only receive that funding, but they also receive individualized support. And, this being kind of a pilot program, it allows for us to have a lot of flexibility and to be able to change the approach and change the way that the companies are managed based on their progress. So I do encourage companies to apply for both Catalyze and small business grants. We generally give out a lot more small business grants, but Catalyze has some really great support services that the past awardees have been able to take advantage of. Next slide, please. So thus far, most of the funding opportunities that we have released for the Catalyze program have focused on product definition type activities. So some of the examples of the activities supported by the Catalyze program include, determining the mechanism of action for drugs, product generation, developing assays for identifying potential new therapeutics, as well as focusing on the prototype design and development of devices and diagnostics. So in the future, we are hoping to have more funding opportunities that focus on other preclinical activities. One thing that is important to note, though, is that the Catalyze program does support a lot of activities that are normally supported in the small business program, but they do not support any clinical work or engagement with the FDA. So if you are thinking about performing a clinical trial or any, like an IND enabling study, for instance, you might want to stick to just the small business program. But if you're performing very early product definition activities, you might want to look into applying for one of the Catalyze RFAs. Next slide, please. So here are some of the Catalyze funding opportunities that are available. So we are currently awaiting the new funding opportunities for each of these groups. But one thing that is important to remember is that we have funding opportunities for the development of new devices, new diagnostic assays, small molecules and biologics, and transformative platforms and enabling technologies. So if you were a US-based academic nonprofit researcher or a small business, you are eligible to apply for this program. And if you're interested, I can put you in touch with my colleague, Dr. Mike Peck, who directs the Catalyze program. Next slide, please. So if you are new to the small business program and you're looking for some great educational content, I highly encourage you to check out our NHLBI Small Business Hangouts playlist. So here are some of the examples of the subjects that we cover in these videos, but they are the link up there links to all of them. And these mostly include kind of talks by some of our in-house experts about things such as writing your commercialization plan for your phase 2 application, interacting with the FDA, basics of intellectual property, patent litigation. So these are just examples of some of the subjects we cover. But if you're curious, I recommend that you check out the videos. Next slide. So here are some other resources I recommend everybody take a look at in addition to the Small Biz Hangouts. So if you are going to be applying for a phase 2 or a fast track grant, you're going to need to put together a commercialization plan. Our colleagues at NIDA have a really great tutorial for how to put one together. I also recommend taking a look at sample applications from applicants who've previously been successful awardees. So luckily we have several great examples on the NIAID website, as well as our colleagues at the National Institute on Aging and the National Cancer Institute. The SF424, That is basically the manual for applying to the small business grants through grants.gov. I highly recommend having a copy of this on hand, just to make sure that you are doing the submission process correctly. The annotated form set as well is very useful. It shows you which documents go where. And NIH Reporter is another great database that I'd recommend becoming familiar with. So if you want to see whether or not the NIH is supporting something, you can search in NIH Reporter. There is a kind of a subpage of Reporter called NIH Matchmaker. So if you want to see which program officer has the area of expertise that you need, you can paste a summary of your project and it will basically give you a list of program officers with that area of expertise. Next slide, please. And so if you would like to stay up to date with the NIH small business program as a whole, there is the listserv and the email address. Also, they can be followed at NIH Seed on Twitter. If you have an inquiry for us, I have included the link to our small business inquiry form. I also recommend signing up for our newsletter. We send out periodic updates about new funding opportunities and programs. So if you'd like to stay in the loop, I recommend signing up for our newsletter. You can also follow us at NHLBI_SBIR on Twitter. And if you have a question, you can reach me and my colleagues at NHLBI_SBIR at mail.nih.gov. Next slide. So thank you all so much for letting me come and speak with you. And now I am ready to take any questions you might have. Okay, so I do have a question in the chat from Stuart. All right, so what are one or two biggest mistakes that SBIR applicants make? That is a really good question. So it depends on what you mean by types of mistakes, Stuart. So one of the common errors that I see people run into is when they wait too long to submit their application and they don't get their registrations done in time. So, you know, in order to be eligible for small business grants, there are a series of registrations that need to be completed before the grant deadline. And some of those take several weeks to process. So basically, if you don't get your registrations done and you wait till the last minute, then you're more likely to run into issues. One of the other mistakes that I see people making is that they try to write a small business grant like a research project grant. This is something I see a lot from academic investigators. So these are people who are brilliant scientists and they have spent their lives writing R01s. So that is their bread and butter. But there are a lot of differences in terms of how R01s are written versus how small business grants are written. So with an R01 or an R21 or any sort of research project grant, your goal is to advance scientific knowledge. So you're trying to find a new biological pathway. You're trying to find a mechanism of action. You're trying to learn more about some sort of biomedical process. For a small business grant, finding out new scientific knowledge is something that will probably happen, and it is a great side effect, but that's not your end goal. Your end goal for the small business grant is to develop a product that is going to be able to be commercialized and is going to be able to advance the mission of the National Institutes of Health. So something that's going to make a difference in the lives of patients that are suffering from heart, lung, blood, or sleep disorders. So that's kind of the biggest mistake that I think a lot of people make. That's another reason why I highly recommend looking over sample grant applications and seeing how small business grants are written versus R01s. There's definitely less of a focus on like the mechanistic side of things and more focusing on, you know, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to do to prove feasibility. And this is what, you know, this is the unmet clinical need that we're trying to achieve.
If anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and hop on video if you would like to ask Stephanie questions.
I do have another, question from Peter. What is the percentage of applications submitted that get funded? So that's a good question, Peter. It varies based on institute, it varies based on mechanism. That data is publicly available NIH-wide, and it is available in the NIH data book. I can send you a link to that. As a whole, most people, when they apply for a phase 1 SBIR grant, usually I think about like 11% of them get funded the first time, but about 37 or so % of people who resubmit an application get funded. So it evens out to about 22%. The reason I mention that is because a lot of people will apply once, they won't get funded, and they get discouraged, and then they don't try again. I just wanted to specify that a lot more people than you think get funded after they don't get funded the first time. So it is always a good idea to resubmit, and after addressing any critiques in your summary statement. For fast track awards, the overall success rate is about 17%. It's about 11 or so % for direct to phase 2s. So if you're thinking about going for a fast track or direct phase 2, I would highly recommend reaching out to a program officer to see whether or not that is an appropriate mechanism. For a lot of businesses, it's a great mechanism. For some people, it's a little bit too advanced. And in my experience, it's sometimes sometimes it's easier to go in and get a phase 1 if you're not very experienced with the NIH grant submission process. But everybody's situation is different. Okay, I have another question. How has COVID-19 affected NHLBI's small business grant priorities? So I would say as a whole right now, it hasn't really affected our scientific priorities as much as you'd think. One thing, so we are one of the institutes that has probably gotten more COVID-related applications than other institutes, except for maybe NIAID. So obviously, one of our huge scientific interests is looking at how to deal with, how to treat COVID-19 patients who are dealing with pulmonary complications. So we have had a lot of applications come in that are specifically like, an improved ventilator prototype or a therapeutic for treating acute respiratory distress syndrome in COVID-19 patients. So really what the best thing I can say as far as COVID-19 is we are interested in things that will help patients that are suffering from pneumonia or some sort of acute respiratory distress syndrome, not necessarily COVID-19 specific, but if it fulfills that, that scientific interest of our lung division, talk to me and I'll let you know whether or not I think it's a good fit. What I would not recommend is I wouldn't recommend changing your proposal to fit COVID-19's like the COVID-19 pandemic if it's not something that has, is a natural fit for your proposal. Okay, Peter has a question. How are the reviewers selected? Is their background considered or are most from the academic or manufacturing arena? That's a great question, Peter. So study sections that review small business grants are different than the study sections that review research project grants, such as RO1s. One of the major differences is that these, the people on the small business study sections are going to be, a lot of them are people who have academic experience, but they also have entrepreneurial experience as well. If you'd like to see some of the examples of the types of reviewers that serve on study sections for small business grants, I can send you a link to the Center for Scientific Reviews page of all the small business study sections. One of the things that is really great is that all of the rosters or the most recent versions of the study section rosters are posted. So if you want to see what kind of people are going to be reviewing your small business grant, you're welcome to take a look at them at any time. A lot of them are special emphasis panels, which means they will bring in people on an ad hoc basis if they have an area of expertise. that is needed to review a certain group of applications, but as a whole, a lot of them do have standing members. So to answer your question, you know, sometimes people are brought in based on a specific area of expertise, but a lot of people are there because they have a knowledge of that technology type, that disease area, and they have a combination of business and scientific expertise. Okay, so, all right, how do applicants choose the study sections? Okay, so there is a way that you can suggest a study section. Ultimately, you know, the study section and the institute that you want your application to go to, ultimately the Center for Scientific Review makes that final choice. So unfortunately, we at NHLBI and the applicant doesn't have the final say, but there is a form in your grant called the PHS assignment request form where you can suggest the primary and secondary awarding component. So for instance, if you want a certain institute to be the primary assigned institute on a grant, you can put them down. Like, so let's say you want us to be the primary, you can put down NHLBI. For study sections, you can also list a few study sections that you think would be useful for reviewing your grant. But, you know, what I would recommend is I would look on the web page, look at the kind of the types of technologies that study section normally reviews grants for. I would take a look at the reviewers and their areas of expertise. There are some cases where there are multiple study sections that have expertise that would be suitable for your application. So sometimes it's just a matter of which group of people would you prefer to be reviewed by. And ultimately, while the Center for Scientific Review has the final say, it doesn't help. I mean, it doesn't hurt to put a request down because they usually try to take that into account. Okay, so I have a question as well about what stage of technology development would be a best fit for fast track applications. So basically, a fast track application, it is recommended in two cases. One is if you're more advanced than a regular phase 1 and you want to do an STTR. So STTRs do not have a direct to phase 2 option. That is SBIR only. So if you would like to kind of skip ahead of the normal phase 1 grant process and you have to apply to the STTR mechanism, that's one case where a fast track would be appropriate. For SBIR awardees, I would say if you still have some proof of concept work to be done, but you're a little bit too advanced for a phase 1. The other area in which I would recommend a fast track is being more advanced in your prototype development or preliminary data is the first. And the second is in terms of how advanced is your company in terms of your commercialization. So when you submit a fast track application, you do have to provide a commercialization plan. It's the same as a phase 2. So if that is something where, you know, you haven't really put a lot of thought into a commercialization strategy, even if you have a more advanced prototype, I might consider doing a phase 1. So really it's a matter of if you have a more advanced prototype developed and if you've kind of worked out your commercialization strategy. But if you're not quite even if you're not quite ready for a phase 2, if you have those two requirements, a fast track might be a good option. Okay. Okay, so Peter asked a question about the sample or format for writing a cover letter when resubmitting an application. So Peter, I would recommend looking at the sample grant applications, specifically the NIA ones. They have 3 out of the 4 of the applications that are included on the website are original applications and then the resubmitted version. So 3 out of 4 are applications that got funded the second time. And so you can see in there the cover letter as well as the introduction, which is the page where they summarize all of the things they changed in response to the reviewers. I would recommend taking a look at those. I think they did a really good job of addressing the critiques in the summary statements. So if you kind of like to see how it's structured, I would take a look at those. Can TABA funds be used for regulatory consultants? It depends on your specific aims. So for instance, sometimes if one of your specific aims includes, like, let's say, somebody is developing a device and their specific aim to focuses on submitting their package for a 510K. If that's specifically linked and they hire a regulatory consultant to help put together that submission package. If that's the case, then it would specifically be linked to the R&D activities on the grant and would not be considered TABA. But let's say that wasn't mentioned in the aims or the research strategy, and you just wanted to bring in a regulatory consultant, but it wasn't specifically linked to anything in your research strategy, then it would be considered TABA.
All right, are there any other questions? If not, we will wrap it up. I think there's one more.
Okay, let's see. That's a good question, Jim. So that is something that would be up to you and your company. So there have been companies that have not applied for NIH grants before, and they are, advanced enough to be qualified for a direct to phase 2 or a fast track, and they choose to go that route and they score well. But some people will choose to do the phase 1 just because it's a little bit less time intensive, and it's just less of a administrative burden to put together a phase 1 application. So it really depends upon what you're up for. If you'd rather go for the, some people would rather go for the fast track or the direct phase 2 because they want to get that big money first. Some people would rather just get their foot in the door and get the phase 1 because those are easier to get. So really it's just up to what's best for you and your team. Okay. So we generally don't really work with contracting officers at the NIH unless we're doing SBIR contracts, and that's a completely different ballgame. I would recommend talking with a program officer about that in terms of determining which one is the better mechanism. Okay, one more question from Stuart. So NSF does fund some applications related to health technologies. But that is very true. The NIH focuses a lot more on clinical applications. And we've actually had people get a phase 1 SBIR award through the NSF, but apply for a phase 2 application through the NIH once their project gets to be a little bit too clinical for the NSF. So there is some overlap between us and the NSF, but I would definitely say that if you're going, for example, if you're going to be doing any kind of clinical study, clinical trial, any sort of human subject study, definitely you're going to want to apply to us.